My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Charis also is the proud bookstore partner of Agnes Scott College, and Agnes Scott College is our partner for tonight's event, specifically the Department of Religious Studies. And it's really exciting for us when we get to celebrate a graduate of Agnes Scott College. So we're here to welcome Lucia Hulsether, who is a graduate, in conversation with Emily Owens for a discussion of Lucia's book, Capitalist Humanitarianism. This event is super exciting to me because I am teaching a class about nonprofits and the ethics of the nonprofit world and capitalism this semester. So I've invited my students here tonight as well. So it's going to be a lot of Agnes Scott folks in the house. I'm really, really, really thrilled that we got to make this happen. We've been talking about it for a long time. I know we've got some Agnes Scott professors in the audience tonight. We probably have some other Agnes Scott grads watching. So thank y'all. If you want to shout out where you're watching from, I see Professor Tina Pippin in the chat, who is, the one always, we are saying, always speaking truth to power from the Religious Studies Department. I'm going to introduce Emily Owens. Emily is the David and Michelle Ebersman Assistant Professor of History at Brown University, where she teaches about histories of race, gender, and sexuality in the United States. She researches U.S. slavery, the legal history of race and sexual violence, and the intellectual history of American feminism. She also writes histories of the present that explore how structural racism and misogyny get expressed in ordinary life. She's the author of Consent in the Presence of Force, Sexual Violence and Black Women's Survival in Antebellum New Orleans. And that came out from the University of North Carolina Press in 2023. So welcome, Emily. We're glad you're here. And of course, the person of the hour is Lucia Hulsether, who is an assistant professor of religious studies at Skidmore College. She has broad interests in religion, culture, and politics in the Americas, with primary intellectual commitments to feminist queer theory, critical race and ethnic studies, and the histories of social movements. Her first book is the one that we're celebrating tonight, Capitalist Humanitarianism, which explores the historical interplay between 20th century left socialist organizing and neoliberal projects to make free markets ethical with respect to the racialized and feminized populations that they dispossess. So this book is very, very urgent. I feel like every day more and more urgent. And so I'm really excited for y'all to get right into it. I do want to let folks know that you can ask questions at any time. And in fact, we encourage you to ask questions as they occur to you, so that they can weave them into the conversation. You can ask them in the chat, or you'll see a little question mark icon towards the right. That's our Q&A box. You can put them in there. And if you see a question that's similar to one that you wanted to ask, you can just upvote that question so that we can avoid redundancy. All right. Without further ado, thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having us, and thanks for that introduction, Lucia. It's such a pleasure to be able to talk with you about this book, and I'm so grateful to you for your friendship over so many years, but also I'm so grateful to you for writing such a killer book. It is Capitalist Humanitarianism is a once in a generation book, and I'm really excited to be able to talk with you about it today. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and we've been in conversation with one another for more than a decade, so we're just going to chat here. And I look forward also to welcoming the folks in the audience to join us, and to getting a sense of what their questions are too. So to start us off, I wondered if you would just introduce us to this project. Tell us what Capitalist Humanitarianism is trying to do.
Cool. First, before I answer that question, let me just echo the thanks to everyone at Charis who helped us put this event together. So ER and Dartrisha, also to my dear beloved mentor, teacher, and friend and podcast co-host, Tina Pippin at Agnes Scott, who has been a champion of this event. And Emily, it's just like, it's always been such a gift to be in conversation with you. And I feel, excited and energized by just seeing your face across the screen. So we'll get going. It's good to be here. And thanks to everyone for coming and joining us. So, okay, Capitalist Humanitarianism. It's the title of my book. And by Capitalist Humanitarianism, I mean a few things. So I'll back up and say that I came to writing this book, which is, as ER said, about the projects, the sort of amalgamation of projects to make free market capitalism into an imagined vehicle for expressing solidarity with oppressed people who capitalist economies have systematically dispossessed along lines of race and class and gender and sexuality, and the list goes on. I came to this project in part as a grassroots organizer in economic justice movements, anti-racism work, immigration justice organizing in Atlanta. And one of the things I started to notice was the ways that major corporations, Coca-Cola was the main one that I started thinking about first in Atlanta, but also institutions of higher ed, all kinds of companies had started to appropriate this language that I associated with social justice movements. And I wondered, like, how was it that Coca-Cola could be, say, poisoning water wells in all over the place and assassinating union leaders, and also claim to be this sort of global champion of progressive multiculturalism and free choice. So I got really interested in hypocrisy. As I started doing the project, the question began to shift a little bit, which it became less, or well, it became about corporate hypocrisy, and it became about sort of elite enterprises appropriating this left, what I thought was kind of a left social justice grassroots language. But it also became about how left organizing movements, particularly a lot of anti-capitalist Christian socialists, but not only, had begun to see the tools of finance capitalism and consumer transactions and corporate philanthropy as themselves vehicles for their projects of liberation. And when did that shift happen? And so that's what the book is about. That it began as a dissertation. It involves archival research into the histories of major fair trade groups as one of the founders, also microfinance groups, and also ethnographic research, particularly in Guatemala and at various kinds of responsible finance conferences and events throughout the US. And I'm happy to say more about any of that, but let me just pause.
Yeah, let me ask you about that actually. So I think on the one side, this book helps us understand the myriad of institutional forms that sort of seem pretty evil on their face and then say, hey, we're doing something great. Don't worry about it. And I think that, in watching this book materialize over the last couple of years and then finally in reading it in its finished form, it's been really exciting because it's one of these projects that like clarifies something through a set of contained examples in the book, but it's so theoretically rich that you keep seeing the thing everywhere. So I'll give you an example. There's an ad that plays on the podcast that I listen to for ExxonMobil. And that ad begins with them sort of saying like, we're going to green up the world and plant some trees and power, electric industry, and like climate is our goal. And then the end of the ad says, who are we? We're ExxonMobil. Believe it. It's kind of this like amazing moment that really is reiterated so many times in the corporate jargon that exists in this project. So in one sense, that is everywhere and it's unbelievable. And yet it's totally functioning and, working for these companies. There's a way that has become quite legible, I think, in the time that you've written this book. And this book really helps us understand what's actually happening at play. And I think you really see in the stories that you tell a set of like fairly good faith actors on the corporate side, on the capitalist side, who are saying like, yeah, no, we really actually think we can do good with capitalism. But then there's this other set of actors who I think are significantly less familiar to those of us who are just walking around the world and listening to our favorite podcasts or whatever. And those are the actors who you just mentioned sort of toward the end of your preamble, the microfinance actors, the fair trade actors, and the folks who are coming who come into this project really through your attention to the Christian left. So I wondered if you might give us an example of one of the stories that you tell in this project that sort of helps us understand the kind of change over time within the Christian left, wherein this set of actors are beginning to imagine radical politics as possible to express through capitalism.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of my sort of go-to examples of this, which feels particularly relevant today, is the origins of fair trade. So fair trade, you go into any grocery store, you're going to see products marked direct trade, fair trade. It's coffee, it's chocolate, it's all kinds of things, and that becomes kind of the institutional basis for other things like consumerism that gives back, like Tom's shoes or Warby Parker glasses. If you buy this, we'll give a pair to someone in need. The first major fair trade organization in the Americas, in the world, is 10,000 Villages. Some folks on this event will know of a 10,000 Villages store. 10,000 Villages is a project of the Mennonite Central Committee. They were founded by Mennonite overseas workers, what probably people outside of Mennonite communities would call missionaries in popular parlance. They have different language for it. But women who were stationed in colonial territories or territories that were newly either in some sort of colonial contestation in Puerto Rico and in Palestine. And there were men who were ordained clergy often, and their wives who were encountering a whole lot of privation that, if we know the history of these places, is caused by the sort of immediacy of displacement of indigenous people, of empire, of war, and all of the poverty that brings. In Palestine, and particularly in sort of Jordan, that becomes the West Bank in the late 1960s. So this is around the 6 Days War. 10,000 Villages, which begins as the Needlework Project, has started as a project of these women who are like, we as women want to help other women. This isn't an economic project. This is about empowering people. There's this language of empowerment. There's this language of self-sufficiency. And with the Mennonite Central Committee, there's this language of we want to be in but not of the world. So if you know anything about Anabaptist traditions, what you know is that there's this historical sort of separatism that there's often from Anabaptist missionaries related to the Amish. They often don't serve in the military. They're conscientious objectors because there's this idea that, my loyalty is to God, not to the state. So we're remaining separate. We're remaining away. Likewise, there's a pretty radical critique of U.S.-led, Europe-led capitalist globalization. So the idea is that they're going to create these alternative markets so that the people that they're trying to help become self-sufficient, particularly by selling their needlework, will not be as integrated into these global markets, can keep their traditions, but it's this direct trade relationship between Mennonite people at their churches and the Palestinian women and Puerto Rican women onto a sort of smaller scale who are making these designs of tablecloths, pillowcases, very feminine, domestic kinds of things. Well, 10,000 Villages, which is 10,000 Villages in the 90s. By early on, they're the Needlework Project. They become self-help crafts in the 1970s, and then they turn into the needlework, or into 10,000 Villages in the 90s. They rebrand from needlework to self-help when they grow, and the reason that they grow is the 6 Days War and the mass second displacement of Palestinians from their homelands. So after 1967, between 1967 and 1973, and the years right beyond that, Palestine, incorporated state of Israel, is flooded with more settlers and tourists and businesses and soldiers. And guess who is buying the designs made by Palestinians in the Needlework project / self-help / 10,000 villages. So we have these letters from Mennonite women to like back to headquarters, back to base, back to their families saying, wow, like we feel really weird that the thing that like put us on the map, and like now we have 900 people working for us all in refugee camps whose kids and fathers and husbands have died, is the fact that like we are selling their things to the occupying army in order to help them. And that seems like a contradiction, but they're also like, what else do we do? And so I've been thinking about like, if you went into Rafah, right? If somebody went into Rafah right now, or went into Lebanon and said, in a refugee camp and said, we want to help you rebuild your lives. Why don't you do this social entrepreneurship project and make this thing and we'll sell it? On one hand, okay, like I guess you're doing something, but like that's your response, and that's the basis of the institution. And so that's the sort of example that I lift up in the first chapter of my book, and it's been so heavy on my mind lately.
Yeah, it's been heavy on my mind as well. And I think that I'm really glad that you turned to that example, because I was hoping that we would talk about that. There's a moment, I'm not going to read your own book to you, but there's a moment where you raise a set of questions that really capture exactly that contradiction that you are describing right now. Sort of like, how long does it force you to occupy before it's okay to think that the jewelry of the occupied people is really pretty, right? Like that kind of like softening of war making through a kind of like cultural and aesthetic fantasy. I think that gets reiterated throughout the book. I want to ask you to do two things next. One is to clarify for listeners an answer that you just posed and that I think is really heavy in this project, which is on one sense, it could be dismissed as naive, but I think also is a question that you don't think of as naive. You actually work through and deal with head on, which is like the simple question of like, well, wait, what's so bad about that? Right? Like, what's so bad about Tom's Shoes wanting to give away shoes? Like, what's so bad about microfinance? What's so bad about 10,000 villages, repurposing needlework crafts of Palestinian women and selling them to IDF soldiers? Like, can you spell that out for us?
Yeah.
And the second question is, I'd love to hear a little bit of the prose of this project, if you wouldn't mind just like turning to your book and sharing with us sort of how it works internally, the kind of like dense and rich language of this book.
Great. Thanks for that. Yeah. So what is so bad about it? I think to that question, I sort of, in my mind, divide that up into sub-questions. What futures does it build? How does the sort of articulation of solidarity through transactions, be they financial, consumer, et cetera, what does it do to our vision of politics and ourselves as actors and the potential of our solidarity? And what is it substituting for? So I could give you a lot of different examples of how I think, and I will read one in a moment. Positive participation in global free markets on an individual level is misrecognized as solidarity, or is a really anemic kind of solidarity. But what I would say first is that I think the repetition of this in the ExxonMobil advertisement that you're talking about, or in the Tom's Shoes, has taught, certainly it has taught me, and I have had to unlearn the instinct. Like it becomes an emotional instinct at some point to be like, oh yeah, I feel great when I like buy the cup of fair trade coffee or give a donation to the Kiva microfinance entrepreneur. Like I feel really good when I do that, and I might be doing something, when in fact what I might also be doing is participating in a structure that privatizes social welfare. So this is not public good. This is not public education when I buy some coffee in order to like fund some charter school or somebody's like private. This isn't healthcare. This is like a sort of neo-missionary work. But I have learned, but it's partly changing me as a person. So I think that like one of the things that's genius about capitalist humanitarian projects writ large, and that could, there's a lot that could fit under that. And I think about your work, Emily, on affective objects. So Emily has a really amazing book, everybody, called Consent in the Presence of Force, Sexual Violence and Black Women's Survival in Antebellum New Orleans, which I'm going to show on the screen. And you have this part where you basically have asked like white men in antebellum New Orleans could were complicit in forcing sex from Black women all the time. Why did they pay for it in some economies? And one of the things that I feel like that you argue is that it's about the affective world around the transaction. How does it feel to get consent for this rather than to force it? And I think that we thought so much about like the affect and transaction and economies together. And I think one of the things I continue to think about with capitalist humanitarianism, buying these products, is like, I know that there is no ethical consumerism under capitalism. Like that's a slogan. But what can I do to make myself feel slightly less worse about it?
Right. The project of capitalist humanitarianism doesn't just do work on the people who it is purporting to help. It does work on the consumer.
And that teaches me a kind of politics that is depoliticizing. So you might contrast it to like actually paying taxes, like having like an actual like working tax system. You might contrast it also to the boycott or the refusal, or I'm not going to buy this. Why? Like it's buying in rather than opting out. And so I would say that it's working on both parties. It's also often like deeply fetishizing of like the global South woman as a figure, and the global South child. And so I think about like what dynamics of imperialism is it re-embedding?
So read to us a little, will you?
Okay, so I am going to read because I want to make sure there's time for questions. So what I'm going to read is a section of the book. So the book is divided into 6 chapters, and between them there are these little interludes that kind of situate the sort of more ethnographic and historical chapters in the context in which I wrote them, which was a context of grief and a context of union organizing at Yale University, where I got my PhD. I'm going to read to you from one of the chapters, and it's the last chapter of the book. In this chapter, I am in Guatemala, where there's been a lot of sort of like ground zero, like microfinance incursion. And there was this bank, which in my book is called, they have a pseudonym, Capital for Change. And they have organized what was billed as a social action adventure tour, where a group of US people, mostly donors and board members of the bank, were going around to different micro enterprises in Guatemala. And often these were run out of people's homes. So it would be a group of like white tourists showing up with the local bankers. So it's like the US micro bank lending to a smaller micro bank in Guatemala, or bank in Guatemala, which then lends to individual people. So we'd show up with their bankers at their doors and knock and say, can we see your children? Can we see your like weaving loom? And so this is a scene. So this chapter is organized by like the different stops on the tour. This is a scene about the last stop on the tour, which was sort of billed as like, this is what microfinance can do for the community. So I'm going to read from that. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Now I'm looking in my book. All right. The final stop on the day's social action adventure tour was a footwear factory. Our banker guides regaled us with its backstory on an hour-long journey through elevated, bumpy terrain. The owner of the enterprise launched it as a solo startup with a $150 loan, and less than 4 years later, he had grown it into a shoe manufacturing business with 40 employees. Unlike other micro enterprises, which were run out of their founders' homes, this one had acquired commercial property near the center of town. One side of the street ran along a mountain's razor edge, which plunged downward to the farm plots and houses below. On the other side, a few children milled outside of a primary school and sleepy bodegas advertised discounted sodas. Our van pulled to the side, we unloaded and approached the door of the unmarked two-story building. We filed into a dim downstairs cluttered with furniture and tables. A staircase, which was more like a glorified ladder jutting out from a hole in the ceiling, descended into the middle of the room. Beneath those stairs, a woman hunched under a Bunsen burner. We passed her on our way to the steps, which led to a brighter room where about 20 people worked on a haphazard assembly line. Fabrics, shoe molds, and various cutting and measuring tools had spilled from crisscross tables onto a floor so cluttered with detritus that only about half of it was visible. I calibrated every step to avoid tripping, not least near a table with more open flames. Torn out pages from an old swimsuit magazine issue decorated a segment of the wall. Stressed? Asked a newsprint caption glued near one of the photos. Masturbate. It will relax you. Less than a minute in, my surroundings had turned blurry. Were the glue fumes affecting my balance? Why were there no windows in here? I began a countdown for how long I could hold my breath, and only then did I register the youth of the workers themselves. They can go to school in the morning and then come work here to earn money, the founder of the business explained over the noise. Their families needed the income, he said, so they came here to paste together shoe parts, melt down globs of plastic, sew canvas, and thread laces through tiny holes. They also showed up to talk and laugh with their friends. The sounds of their chatter clanged off the concrete walls. Meanwhile, two older men circled the room in apparent supervision of the production process, directing the workers back to their tasks with a spoken reprimand or a physical touch on the shoulder. Our group fanned out to the extent that we could. One of the board members snapped photos. At no point did our group actually talk to the workers, except in those instances when certain tourists half requested a person's consent to a photo and half announced their intention to take one. They would nod or sometimes giggle or make fleeting eye contact and then return to whatever they had been doing before. I loitered by the exit and inhaled through my t-shirt. If I was heaving for breath, how were these workers faring? How were they working? And how would one even begin to describe the scene without sensationalizing it? Our leaders had prepared us to encounter a prize micro-enterprise developed by a guy who had started fixing shoes as a side gig out of his house and then grown into the biggest employer in town. They had brought us to a sweatshop. Back in the van, my tour mates buzzed. He's employing the youth of the community, the board member said, scrolling through her trove of digital photos while her daughter peeked at them over her shoulder. What a great opportunity for them, added a longtime donor. I swallowed, tried not to unleash a tirade, and interjected with all of the diplomacy I could muster. I don't know. They looked pretty young. Did anyone have concerns about the air quality? When my seatmate replied that it was messy and stuffy, but seemed fine otherwise, I showed her the photo I'd taken of the masturbation quip. At the time, I was confident that it would prove something about the bad working conditions. My neighbor, the adult daughter of the donor, raised her eyebrows and agreed that the display was, quote, weird, but the director interrupted before any discussion could get traction. She told us that the factory was the best option that these kids had, not least because they were building skills on a record of work that would help them land more lucrative jobs in the future. It was like parallel universes. I saw sweatshop labor. They saw empowerment. I'm going to read one more paragraph, skipping ahead. The figure of the laboring child has played a recurring role in debates over how best to approach economic regulation and social provision. Gilded Era progressives made soot-faced waifs toiling on assembly lines into mascots of campaigns for workplace safety measures. Cold War propaganda vested American national identity and moral exceptionalism in the private nuclear family whose children went to school instead of, say, suffering in a Soviet labor camp like Soviet children, and returned home to cookies baked by their own mothers instead of surviving on Moscow's ration gruel. A distorted echo of these figures carried over into the 1990s high tide of anti-NAFTA activism, from workshops at the World Social Forum to Students Against Sweatshops chapters on campuses around the world. Left organizers demanded that consumer publics confront the glassy-eyed, dirt-faced child laborers suffering for the sake of the global North's cheap luxuries. I cannot forget a middle school social studies teacher who dedicated a day to studying the child labor scandal at Nike. We filled out a reading comprehension worksheet about a journalist who had paid $50 for his sneakers to be embroidered with a customized tag. He had filled out the standard order form with his select phrase, sweatshop. But Nike refused to fill the request. It was, quote, inappropriate slang, a spokesperson claimed. Over a decade later, the director of Capital for Change used this same term to reprimand me for voicing concern about labor conditions at the shoe factory. What you said was inappropriate, she admonished me behind a closed door. There are donors on this trip who really care about women's empowerment. Do not make them question our commitment to that. At some point, the criticism of child labor had become more offensive than actual child labor.
Thanks, Lucia, for sharing that. So tell us what's happening there. Tell us why you read that paragraph or that passage for us.
So that was a passage where I think it was one of the most, I had many upsetting and sort of dissonant experiences doing ethnography. But this one particularly stands out because this idea of being conditioned to think that it brought up the question of how we are conditioned and what we are conditioned to see. So there's this idea, I think going into this, I had this idea that, if I could show what was going on, it would reveal that capitalist humanitarianism is not all it's cracked up to be. And yet here I was, like glue fumes, like just making me dizzy, and seeing children working on machines, being touched by these older men going around, and thought that this would be obvious, like, this is not cool. And then when we got back to the van, that wasn't the response from my tour mates. And so then I had to ask myself, like, wait, how did we learn to see this so differently? It wasn't the only time this happened. Like, I didn't read this part, but there was this investor that I talked to who was like seeding these various, like, sort of allegedly social enterprises in Central America. And he had left a sort of private equity job on Wall Street, and I was interviewing him about kind of what projects he was working on. And he came in really excitedly and said, we just made a seed grant to a socially responsible maquilladora and socially responsible sweatshop. And I was like, what the hell? Like, and it's like, dude, like, that's not possible. And he was like, no, there's ventilation. And there's a company store where they can buy what they need. And these aren't kids that are in school. These are kids on the street sniffing glue. And someone pointed out to me, a really wonderful sort of interlocutor, grad student at U Toronto, pointed out to me that the glue that they were using in the shoe factory, when I showed a picture in another talk, is exactly the glue that investor would have been talking about as keeping children on the streets from sniffing by giving them a job. And so there's this idea that I try to talk about in the book of, that's an old colonial idea about which children are deserving of which kinds of futures, and which families are capable of nurturing children, which communities, and keeping them safekeeping. So this factory scene sort of exists in a chapter where I've also talked a little bit about the pressure on women in microfinance programs to have children, but not too many. So this sort of having children in order to work, to staff these global South enterprises, and calling that a positive future, a good job, in the aftermath of, in the case of Guatemala, like 2 generations of civil war, U.S. empire, right-wing dictatorship, just like the wasting of so many lives through the incursion of sort of outsourcing and just dispossession. I think I was trying to see, this was this moment where I was like, okay, this is starting to make sense, because this isn't necessarily articulated as violence. This is being recognized as there's this idea of a socially responsible maquilladora. Sometimes someone at some point had to stop thinking that was a contradiction. And that scene seemed like some of the clue to it.
So in the book, you talk so much about the ways that the various capitalist humanitarians that you sort of profile in the book, or maybe expose, are teaching themselves to see. So there's just like a lot of attention to the varieties of sort of pedagogies of capitalist humanitarianism, the kind of attention to numeracy and the attention to visualizing data, the attention to narrative and history. And I think that simultaneously, I read the book as also inviting readers to see, but to see in a different way. So if part of the question that you're asking in that passage that you read to us is about sort of how do we learn to see? How have these women on the bus learned to see something that you don't see, and vice versa? Like, how have they unlearned to see what you see, or have they never learned to see the thing that you're seeing? You're trying to teach us how to see in this book, and I want to think more with you about what's happening sort of internally in the worlds of the capitalist humanitarians, and that's also coming through in the Q&A a little bit. But I'm wanted to be aware of time and also shift us toward the politics that you see and what you call a politics of pessimism, and the profound role that grief plays in this book. You mentioned a moment ago that you wrote this book in the context of grief, of your own personal grief. And also the way that you tell stories in this book is sort of like shot through with a sort of wry humor that I recognize as like very authentically your own, and sort of like authentically your voice, and also with a kind of deadpan transparency to the mode of storytelling. And I think that's clear in what you just shared with us. So I want to turn our attention to what you call the politics of pessimism, and to grief, and like what role grief and staying with grief plays in the way that you are asking readers to see.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you for that question. And thank you for like distinguishing that like sort of seeing with loss or like feeling with loss as different from the kinds of pedagogies, as a counterpoint to the kinds of pedagogies that business schools or the microbanks that are like telling these often indigenous Black women, you have to take literacy classes, you have to take financial literacy classes, show me your account book. So this question of what are different ways to see, that's a really lovely way of, thank you for reading that in the book.
Well, I mean, there's a way that there's something like that you are constantly surfacing this sort of insane optimism among the capitalist humanitarians. And I think that that's really balanced by the depravity that you are asking us to stare at.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like the extent to which a financier sees a performance of hope and optimism in a person is sometimes how the credit score is calculated if there isn't other evidence, or even if there is other evidence. So how happy are you? How hopeful are you about the future? And like doing this, I was not hopeful about the future. I don't think that exists in I don't think that's a contradiction with having radical politics. And sometimes I think that it's actually can be a foundation for very radical and revolutionary politics. So I'll back up and say a little bit more. So I did the field work for this book, the vast majority of the field work for this book. And then, as you do as a PhD student, you sit down and are ready to write it. And at that hinge point, two things happened. One, the Yale Graduate Teachers and Researchers Union, kind of in a last-ditch effort to get the university to recognize our union before Donald Trump tried to turn over the entire National Relations Board to outlaw graduate unionization. We were on a hunger strike. And I was a hunger striker for 4 days. On my fourth day of the hunger strike, my younger brother, Mark, who's a musician and was experiencing, well, he was a musician working in a very low wage, degrading job at a call center in Milwaukee that was billing itself as a socially responsible enterprise because it involved like giving accessibility services to people who are deaf and hard of hearing. He died from suicide. And so I left the hunger strike and the protest and went back and buried him with my parents and my other brother Doug. Um, and like, people who have experienced a loss like that know that it is a mini apocalypse. And it was an intimate apocalypse. It felt like a political apocalypse as well, because there was no doubt in my mind that like his blood was on the hands of this company. He had begun to experience a certain amount of workplace, like sort of psychosis related to the social dynamics in his workplace that in some ways seemed like a really lucid diagnosis of the violence happening in that space. I had known kind of in the like abstract through political organizing, like that capitalist humanitarianism was what I would consider a pretty deranged response to the knowledge of violence. So like in the context of Guatemala, we like, oh, we know that like plantations have like ruined so many lives. We know that like neoliberal economies have dispossessed so many people. That's why capitalism is going to do better now. So like solar panels on reservations, native reservations in the US that have had oil pipelines built through their land, like those kinds of things. That like one way of reading capitalist humanitarianism is as like a really, really cheap, optimistic, and degrading response to loss and a loss that cannot be repaired. And I'm now forgetting the question. So I think that experience of just there's no coming back from this gave me another way of moving through the project, which was the only way of moving through the project. And in the context of that, Donald Trump had just been elected, and the Yale Graduate Union wasn't going to win, but they did win their union last year, the year before that. So I'm really excited about that. But there's this deep settling of loss, and if there are these losses that we are living with that are not going to be rectified, what does it mean about politics? And I was growing so frustrated with this discourse on a lot of the left that's like, well, if you despair, or if you have pessimism, or if you have a philosophy of negativity or whatever, then you probably are a bad organizer. It just seemed like such a truism. Like you have to have hope in order to be an organizer. And I just felt to myself, that's not true. That radicalizes me more, because what if there is nothing to lose? What would I be willing to risk? And what I felt like was the most dangerous was the responding to gratuitous, unnecessary, empire-induced violence, death, loss, whatever you want to call it, with a like, holly ho, like, let's here to feel better. Let's like buy this fair trade coffee from someone whose entire family was killed by the dictatorship. Like those, like, those are like, those are snide. That's me being like really snide and angry about it. But I think there are other like other examples of this. And so I started to think about like, oh, capitalist humanitarianism is a response to loss. They know that racist capitalism is capitalism. And when we intervene in these micro ways, maybe it's a kind of harm reduction, but it's also a reticence to changing everything.
Yeah, I think that there's a way that this project, I've said this to you before, but I'll say it here so I can say it publicly. I read the first 7 pages without taking a breath, and then like came up for air, because there's a way that your prose barrels toward the reader and is unrelenting, which I think in a way is a kind of performance of what living with loss feels like. And I hear in what you're saying in your answer just now that part of the response of capitalist humanitarianism is an unwillingness to tolerate the loss. It's a wishing it away. It's an imagining it away.
Yeah, I thought it was palliative.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think I want to ask you about the form of the project, which sort of has these two sides. There are, as you just sort of glossed this a minute ago, body chapters that do sort of like traditional monograph argumentative work, and they build the argument of this project, and they tell stories that are ethnographic and archival. And then you have these interludes, which are much more narrative and much more centered in the first person, although of course the first person is present through the book. A little bit of what you just said, I think, already begins to answer this question, but I'll ask it again, which is about why you didn't write 2 books. Why, in the moment of grieving the loss of your brother and, having your internal world torn asunder, as you say, this kind of apocalypse, like, why did that happen for you alongside or in tune with this project? Why didn't you say, okay, I need to write a book about my own personal loss and finish up this dissertation project and sort of into a tidy, academic facing book? Like, why did you write it this way? Or maybe how did you write it this way? Like, tell us more about how this book hangs together with these sort of body chapters and then several interludes that interject in between.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so. I finished it as a dissertation and even sent it off to Duke Press without the interludes. And I got reviewer feedback, and the feedback was the most glowing and positive feedback I could ever imagine. And it gave me the best critique that was the most enabling, which was, whoa, the voices of this is all over the place. Like the voice, like the intensity of the voice is the best asset of this book, and it's completely out of control. And the author needs to get more control over it, because the book would go from like this hyper like dissociated, like I am going to intervene in the literature in this way, to like they have blood on their hands, like and there's these parts where like I'm gonna scream until my face falls off, like just like totally like swinging the reader around without any kind of control. So I ended up connecting with a really amazing literary editor. I used some of my research money to work with a literary editor to think about like, okay, like what's going on. And I had this sort of sense, I started to like write like sort of more creative nonfiction essays. That was mostly what I was reading, was like novels and like queer feminist essays. As I was writing the book. So the voice had already begun. I kind of began to experiment with it in part to counteract these like imperial ways of seeing that we were talking about before. But Hannah asked me a question at one point when we were going back and forth. I gave her something like just completely incoherent, and she said, "Who is this author?" Who is this? Excuse me, narrator. Who is this narrator? And I thought like, okay, so who is the narrator who wrote this book? Like that's the voice of this book. And maybe a clue to why the voice is so disorganized. And the clue to the voice, why the voice is so disorganized, is the narrator is a graduate student who has just come off a hunger strike and like had her brother's funeral earlier that day. I started writing my dissertation like that day, and because it was a way to do something. And so then I started again and thought, okay, what would this book sound like if I treated the narrator as a character, not as like the carbon copy of me, Lucia, talking to you right now, but as like a narrator and a character. And Hannah asked me another question, which was, what would that narrator need to be forgiven for? And so, which is a way of like opening up towards vulnerability and not being like the triumphant narrator. I'm kind of I almost thought about like being an unreliable narrator on purpose, because of this way of seeing things. What truths can we see from somebody who seems a little bit on the edge? And of course, that's in part homage to my brother and his psychosis and how he was diagnosing these power dynamics at this call center that were invisible to everyone else. I think you were right. And so that's kind of how it came together. My another friend said, the interludes came together pretty quickly. It was like they were hidden under the floorboards the whole time, like being this sort of like shadow animator of the project. grateful to the reviewers who said, get the voice under control, but don't cut it out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you might read to us just one more passage.
We can go to Q&A.
A sense of the work that getting your narrative voice under control has done for the project.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read. So the interludes sort of I sort of imagine them as almost like photographic negatives of the chapters. So the dynamics of like the pathologization of indigenous mothers, or like the sort of valorization of children as the future that's going to like be some sort of like cheap repair out of generations of genocide, like those kinds of things. Like I try to think, okay, like what are the dynamics of this that are showing up in grief, in organizing at the time when I was doing this. So they're seen as, they're trying to illuminate each other in a way that rhymes but isn't exactly the same. So passage that I'm going to read, I know is your favorite passage. And it goes with the sixth chapter, which I also just read from. So it's about this sort of future children. What are children supposed to do, and how do we stay with loss? Okay. And hello to my mother if you're here. You're about to hear about yourself. I know I'm not supposed to judge the grieving for their processes. Everyone has their own experience of loss. That's what the loveliest of humans, the ones who baked us casseroles and who remember the anniversary year after year, always say. But I do fault people for how they grieve, and I think you should too. If not for the feelings themselves, then for how the causes and consequences of those feelings tend to get a political pass, how they insulate lived experience from critique and underwrite dubious recovery projects, whether or not they're conscious of it. I inherit my standards from my mom. This is a compliment to her. After Mark died, she announced a race for what we called the Consolation Prize. It involved ranking the most gratuitously bad attempts at comfort. The third place prize, awarded in part on the basis of its repetition, went to her colleague, who on a near daily basis harangued her. You can't walk around sad forever. You have to reclaim your joy. The second place prize was clinched by the man who approached her at a meeting of Presbyterian clergy, rested his hands on her shoulders, and said, Mark lived exactly the perfect amount of days. He was 26, as a side note. Not a day longer or shorter than he should have. He died at precisely the right time. I want you to believe that. The grand prize went to the person who, after he overheard my mom say something about her boy being at peace now, felt moved to inform her that she, as a minister, should know better. It was possible, after all, that Jesus had remanded her boy to hell. Whatever the Lord's judgment, we trust in its righteousness, he boomed, patting her back. The Lord is always righteous. The Lord's judgment has nothing on mine. Neither does my mother's. I am making an inventory of all the worst ways to express grief. Where do you even start? There was Achilles, who responded to the death of his boyfriend by slaughtering thousands of people on the battlefield, then revenge murdering the perpetrator and dragging his corpse around Troy on the back of a chariot. There was God, whose grief at the scale of sin prompted him to commit genocide on the planet, except for Noah and his cherry-picked companions, with a catastrophic flood. There are the less mythical examples. I'd nominate anyone who ever cited the death of John McCain or Ronald Reagan or any other war criminal statesman to silence popular dissent or valorize civility. I'd dedicate a whole category to the generational traumas used to justify military occupation, apartheid, and racist state building. I'd file that next to the bracket that tracks the mass commodification of loss, breast cancer ribbons and the tyrannical optimism they inflict on the sick, designer t-shirts emblazoned with the latest victim of police murder, rainforest certified products by companies that dump tons of wildlife murder and carbon into the air, any grief memoir that effaces its political context, any grief memoir that is the preface to an advice manual for corporate executives, any grief memoir that ends in a nationalist credo, any grief memoir that derives closure from new babies, any and all grief that imposes normativity on the most endangered of the dead, the queer, the mad, the disconsolate, the extreme, the uncompromising, the lost.
Thank you for reading that. I have so many more questions, and we are very nearly out of time. So I want to ask you just one more, which is really rooted in the honor that it is for, I think, both of us to be talking about your book in the space of Charis Books, which is, what does your book, Capitalist Humanitarianism, have for feminism?
That's a really good question. I think what it has for feminism, there are ways that I could answer this question at a surface. Like, there are many ways I could answer this question with the book, which is, there's an analysis of the sort of predation on particularly women in the global South that has been perpetrated in the name of their empowerment. So there's an analysis of that. There is a kind of standpoint, like theory from experience, that is put into conversation with other traditions of radical critiques. It doesn't just stay with experience, or like think of experience as beyond critique, but like uses it as a tool for critique. So I think there's a feminist method here. But what I would say, I mean, this gets to our question about negativity, is that what I've tried to do is express and perform and enact a kind of fidelity to feminist refusal and the feminist queer no, to say, I'm not going there. I will not participate in recuperative projects that are making promises and delivering death, or something that's not quite death. And I think, that's what I would say is to imagine a feminist refusal and a feminist, queer, anti-racist pessimism, and an invitation maybe to feminism and other traditions and practitioners of radical critique to imagine what sorts of potential might be in that word no.
Lucia Hulsether, thank you so much for writing Capitalist Humanitarianism, and thank you so much for talking to me over these many years and today. I want to give you the last word and then invite E.R. Anderson to come on back and close us out.
I have no last word other than thank you for talking to me about it, and for being so intimate with so many of my thoughts and questions over these many years. It's really an honor to get to talk to you.
It's so mutual.
To share. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This was a great conversation. I just really appreciate all of the, I appreciate modeling the feminist scholarship too, of putting yourself into the text, because I think sometimes we forget that is a thing that we can do, and putting yourself in the text in real time and letting yourself stay there, because I think sometimes that like gets worked out of drafts in ways that isn't always clear to people. So I think modeling that for students and for people who are trying to write books is really important, because our pain and our rage and all of that is part of the academic process, but it so often gets whitewashed and erased. So I'm really grateful to you for talking about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to encourage folks to buy this book. You can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Capitalist Humanitarianism from Charis. Really does help us when you buy event books from us. You can also, of course, encourage your academic institution's library to carry this book. That is very helpful. You can also encourage your public library to carry this book. It is always a good thing to get books like this into libraries. It is important and helpful, and a thing that brings access to a lot more people. So we also would love for you to let folks know that this will be up on our YouTube channel in a couple weeks. So that's another way that you can spread the good word. Do either of you want to shout out any other places folks can find your work or upcoming things that you're involved in?
Emily's awesome book, Consent in the Presence of Force.
Lucia's awesome book.
Yeah. You can buy Emily's book via the link in our chat. So please check out Consent in the Presence of Force. That is also available on the shelves at Charis. Well, thank you both so much. Thanks to everyone who was here with us. And we hope that you all stay safe and well.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Have a great night.